could you tell me roughly what draw? Now you're in Sri Lanka, so you've clearly seen the Chinese footprint growing in Sri Lanka, the Belt and Road Initiative and the political involvements. Um, could you tell us briefly why you chose Sri Lanka amongst other places to come and do some research?
Right. So, I mean, previously during my MA studies, I actually focused on South Asia in terms of Pakistan. And that was what first drew my attention to Sri Lanka. Now, Sri Lanka obviously is a very interesting case because in 2017, Sri Lanka became known as the sort of epitome of Chinese debt trap diplomacy, especially when the China Merchants Port Group, one of the biggest Chinese state-owned enterprises, took over a 99-year lease in Hambantota port. And this was sort of it drew the ire of the international scholarly community, and a lot of, let's say, politicians, a lot of analysts and critics very quickly started to focus on Sri Lanka. And in recent years, after 2019 or so, less attention has been given to Sri Lanka. So when I started my PhD in 2020, I figured it would be good to actually come here to see what's actually happening here and to unravel some of the intricacies of not just China's footprint here, but also how this all relates to Sri Lanka's own political and economic situation.
Okay, so I think coming to Sri Lanka, all Sri Lankans, especially our audience, will notice that the Chinese footprint has grown spectacularly, shall we say? But that doesn't mean that Sri Lanka's relationship with China is new. It doesn't mean Sri Lanka has had a long relationship since the 1950s with the rubber rice pact, which we've heard of. So, how do you view this? How should Sri Lankans view the Chinese investments in Sri Lanka? And what is your advice in terms of, because as you mentioned, I'll just let you in on what I see in Sri Lanka is that there's a very, especially for example, if I can give you an example, when Mike Pompeo came to Sri Lanka a few years ago, most of the national newspapers were very sort of antagonistic towards the United States, especially Mr. Pompeo, as Secretary of State, made some very interesting remarks about Chinese investments, and it was very obvious, sort of, it wasn't subtle at all. It was trying to make us say choose the United States over China, etc. So a lot of Sri Lankans, I think, intrinsically, maybe because of our colonial history, we view the West with a certain amount of suspicion. Now, there's obviously a Western-centric media even in Sri Lanka, and there's a liberal media in Sri Lanka, and they view Chinese investment with a little bit of suspicion. So I want you to tell us, Sri Lankans, should we be suspicious of China? Should we be suspicious of the West? What's your take on this suspicion? And I think this suspicion is not just to Sri Lanka. It's in a lot of places where China has entered, and there's this contradiction between the liberal Western model and the Chinese model. So I know I've put a lot on your plate, but just walk us through that a little bit.
No, but it's an interesting situation because obviously, as you mentioned, Sri Lanka and China have very long-standing, very mutually beneficial relations, going all the way back to ancient traders like Admiral Zheng He coming from China, the Buddhist monk and scholar Fa Xian coming from China to Sri Lanka to study Buddhism here and bringing back scholarly texts and all of these kinds of things. So there's been a very long mutual understanding between the two countries. And I mean, 1952, the Rubber Rice Pact, and then the establishing of official relations in 1957. We've obviously seen the friendship grow in a lot of ways during the years. And especially during the Civil War, I think China was quite, let's say they proved the friendship to Sri Lanka by giving a lot of support, both in terms of armaments and rations and all of these kinds of things, but also political support. And I think this is one of the things that when we're thinking about now the relationship, it strikes me that we have seen in China and Sri Lanka now over the last, say, two years, especially during COVID, but also now during the debt restructuring process, we've seen the two countries move apart quite a bit. There's been a lot of frictions, especially when it comes to the IMF deals and all of these kinds of things. And I think now a lot of Sri Lankans are starting to take a little bit more cautious view when it comes to China than has been the case in the past. I think, generally speaking, most Sri Lankans have had a very positive impression. At least that's my understanding, and that's the people that I've spoken to here have given me the similar kind of view on the matter. But I would also say that it's a difficult situation because of many, many things, especially the geopolitical rivalry in general between the West, especially the Quad countries, so the US, Australia, India, Japan, and also, of course, China then on the other hand, and I mean all of the other smaller players that are interested in sort of vying for influence in Sri Lanka due to its very strategic importance in the Indo-Pacific. I think this is one of the things that reflects itself in all of these matters when we talk about China's footprint, but also when we talk about all of these negative perceptions on China, we have to take into account that there's a lot of, there's a lot of contesting views taking place. There's a lot of criticism that is rooted in, let's say, different ways in which the different Western governments have sort of tried to portray China during the years because of issues such as you can say the China threat theory in general, that China's power is growing, so now we have to contain China. And I'm not here to say that, China should go unchecked. Not at all. I'm just here to say that we have to view China's influence here in view or in light of all of these things. And obviously, as a regular Sri Lankan person, it can be really difficult to sort of unpack the difficult situation of the country, economically, politically, but also what is China actually doing here? What is China's the sort of overarching goals of Chinese investments? And I think for most people, this is a very opaque landscape. And this is what we see in other countries as well, not just in South Asia, but also in European ports such as Rotterdam and Piraeus in Greece and all of these kinds of places in which China has been making inroads in recent years and has been sort of doubling down on its influence. And I think generally speaking, the suspicion is always going to be there. And I think that's a natural byproduct in the sense of China's increasing presence, but also China's increasing influence in a lot of different spheres. And I would say, generally speaking, the way I see it, the investments have had certain benefits. They've also had certain detrimental effects. But I would say that the same has been true for a lot of other investments coming from other countries. Now, we've seen in recent years a lot of countries, I term this sort of geopolitical proxy war taking place in Sri Lanka, or even some sort of geopolitical financial warfare between the big powers taking place in Sri Lanka. So this is something that has been growing, and I mean, especially now, as I said, China's rise and also China sort of retaking its place at the center of the world's political stage. These kinds of rivalries and things will take place more and more often.
As you mentioned, right in the center of geopolitics, global geopolitics, and as we speak, I mean, a few days ago, the Secretary of State of the United States, Secretary Anthony Blinken, was in China. He met top Chinese officials, including Xi Jinping. So, I mean, I suppose we can hope for some sort of a thawing of relations going forward. But it just shows, doesn't it, now, one of the things that I think the Western perspective always likes to point out is that, democracies such as Sri Lanka is one of the oldest, probably the oldest democracy in Asia. And, we should, by the fact of us being democratic, we should be more aligned with the United States versus China. But I want to just give our audience an idea, and you've lived in China, you've studied the country. Can you tell us briefly what the political system is like in China? Because I think people seem to think that China has no democratic input from the people. But that's not strictly true, because China has quite a few elections, is it not? So could you give us a brief idea on what China's political system is like?
Right. So, I mean, the very brief summary of all of this, because obviously it's a big topic in its own right, is that China is a single party state in all respects. So the Chinese Communist Party is at the sort of the top position of power, and even though there are elections, most of the other parties are quite small, and it's usually quite localized as well. So there are no real contenders to the sort of overarching power of the CCP. We have seen in recent years, especially with increased calls. Now, I mean, China's been growing richer and richer during recent years, and we see the middle class and also the more affluent elites in the bigger cities calling for increased ability to sort of have some sort of stake, to have some sort of say in what actually takes place in politics. And in view of this, China has introduced different measures such as what is termed consultative democracy, and all of these kinds of things, in which you have different, I wouldn't necessarily call them direct consultations, but for example, top officials will meet with, let's say, local officials or local stakeholders in different contexts, and they will be talking about, for example, food safety. What can be done to improve food safety measures? What can be done to improve environmental protection measures and these kinds of things? So we see these kinds of things more and more often now.
At the very local level, are people in China voting for their local representatives of the CCP? Do they choose between two? I mean, I know that they're all from the CCP, but can people at the very local, regional level, in the village level, can they choose who represents them at the CCP?
I will say while there is some consultation going on in this area, usually most officials, even the quite local ones, are appointed directly from the central government. So this structure is quite clear in the sense that it's more like a pyramid structure with Xi Jinping and the Politburo Standing Committee at the top. Then under that, the Politburo proper, so this also quite small body of elite politicians. And then under that, we see the National People's Congress and all of these other more, still politically influential, but still subservient to the sort of larger leading small groups and all of these things that are charting ideology and charting overarching policy. So the way in which it works is still that the CCP, the central core of the CCP, dictates all the different policies, and all of the sort of the central government, the provincial governments, the local governments, they just follow suit when it comes to these things.